It's the Big 550 KTRS. I am Paul Harris, filling in for McGraw for a couple more days. Kelly Jackson is here as well. Thanks for following us on Twitter at 550 KTRS, and you can follow me at Paul Harris Show. About a quarter century ago, well, make it more than that, let's say 35 plus years ago, a bunch of Vietnam veterans who felt like they had not been really recognized for their efforts during that war and had not really officially been welcome homed by the United States government, decided to do something about that by getting a memorial to Vietnam veterans built on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It took them several years to get it past Congress and to get private funding and to get an architect to design it for them. But now, that Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the Mall in Washington is the most visited memorial. That's saying something in a town with the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument, the FDR Memorial, the Martin Luther King Memorial. But I used to live in Washington, D.C., and I would have people from out of town come and visit us, and they always wanted to go see the wall with the names on it. And whenever I would go there, I would walk down there into what I called the pit of emotion, because everybody who was there, even if they were not connected to somebody who had died in that war, the more than 54,000 American men who died in that war, they could still feel the emotion, and there were still people leaving remembrances for their fallen loved ones. And that was in the 80s and 90s when I lived there. I can only imagine that as another generation has gone by, that has continued. My next guest is one of the people who helped get the Vietnam Veterans Memorial built in the first place. His name is Robert Dubeck. He served in Vietnam in 1969 as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force and is now executive director of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Robert, welcome to the Big 550.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Do I have the history right?
You have. You did a very good job. I just want to say there's 58,000 names. Over 58,000.
Wow.
I think you said 54.
Yeah.
But I thought you summed it up very well. I was the executive director back in 1980 and 1981, but that is no longer my role.
Okay. So you were there with Jan Scruggs and the others who were putting this thing together, and how difficult was it to convince Congress, first of all, that we needed this?
Well, to be honest with you, that wasn't the hard part at all. Congress was quite receptive, and I think I don't want to be too, you might say, too cynical about this, but you know, we basically came to them and said, okay, we don't want any funding from you. We will raise all these funds through private contributions, and this will be we ask you to give us a site of land on the mall. Now that is that is a very valuable asset, piece of land on the mall in Washington.
Yep.
But there seemed to be a very strong receptivity, because by the time we started this, it was 4 years after the fall of Saigon. There seemed to be a soul-searching going on among Americans about the treatment the veterans had received. And especially when we came forth with the concept that we weren't looking to make any statement about the war itself. We were looking for a symbol to recognize and honor the service and sacrifice of those who served and those who died. And we actually hoped that by doing this, we could help reconcile the country. So I think there was a broad appeal for this idea of reconciliation. I remember the House Majority Leader Jim Wright writing to all members of one committee and emphasizing the reconciliation theme. And when we went out with our first direct mail fundraising piece, it turned out that it was received very well by the American people. You might say by middle Americans, the same people who might support the Boy Scouts and the Cancer Society, because there seemed to be a sense that it was overdue, this recognition.
But you still, as you write about it in your new book called Creating the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, you still ran into opposition from unlikely people like the Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, and billionaire Ross Perot.
That's right.
What was their objection?
Well, here's the thing. Deep down in our country, we still had a lot of fault lines. Um, the war had ended. People were relieved that it had ended, but there was still lingering a tremendous amount of lingering anger and resentment about whether the questions about whether the war was right or wrong, about whether we could have won the war, or else it was a bad idea from the beginning, or else we could have won it but for a domestic fifth column that stabbed us in the back. And of course, there were other similar types of cultural ideas that, about even whether a design of the memorial had to be realistic and whether it had to give a definite message, or it could be reflective and contemplative, which was arthy, that it could allow a visitor to reflect his or her own thoughts. Now, from the beginning, Mr. Perot seemed to think that the only type of memorial possible was something like the Marine Corps Memorial, where you have a bold, heroic statue. And in fact, at the beginning, there were people who simply assumed we were going to put up a statue, and they would say, well, what's the statue going to look like? And then, of course, there were veterans, I would put, who opposed the design, because they basically were looking for a memorial that would say that the war was right and rebuke the anti-war movement and celebrate heroism and glory. And when we came out with something that was rather than a building or a statue, was a place, because that's what the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is.
Yep.
It is a place, and you described that very well. I wouldn't use the word pit.
I only say that because you have to walk down,
All right.
that ramp to get to that bottom, and that whatever the opposite of an apex is, at the bottom of the ramps from
Right.
each side. I've stood there many, many times and just observed the people there, and the emotion just wells up on everyone's face.
I know, and I think that's the genius of the design. I might call it an amphitheater or something like that.
Yeah.
But, I think that is the genius of design, because right in the center of Washington, by taking you down with the reflective black granite walls, it takes you into a different place.
Did you get a lot of hate mail from people once Maya Lin, an Asian woman, was chosen as the designer?
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, that was one of the fault lines that I would say we were going through, whether a person of Asian descent, it was appropriate for a person of Asian descent to design a memorial in which Americans fought against Asians, killed at their hands. I mean, there were hate mail saying, why are you having it designed by Gook, which is the disparaging term that we used in Vietnam.
Yep. Speaking of hate, I was on the radio there, as I mentioned, in the late 80s and early 90s, and I remember maybe 88 or 89 when someone came and defaced several panels of the wall by scratching swastikas deep into the granite. In fact, I helped with your colleague Jan Scruggs raise money to have those panels restored to their original brightness. Have there been incidents like that since then? Do you have these outbreaks of people who just take it out on the wall?
Not really. There have not been many to my memory. The few that's been were in the paper, but I would say over the past 3 decades, we're talking about less than a half dozen.
Good.
I mean, in fact, there's a documentary on TV a friend sent to me today about the monthly ritual of cleaning the wall, and people come from all over the country to participate.
Do people still leave little memoirs there? And if so, what are some of the ones that you particularly noticed over the years?
Well, I think, people, yes, indeed, still leave particular memoirs. People leave letters to their loved ones. People leave photographs. I mean, there have been, many, many cans of beer left because of all the guys who said, if we get out of this, we're going to have a beer together.
Or a bottle of whiskey.
Or a bottle of whiskey.
I've seen those, too.
And there was a group of, Harleys are made up in Milwaukee.
Yep.
A group of veterans from Wisconsin actually, out of parts, built a Harley. and left it at the wall.
Wow.
And that's now kept in the collection at the Smithsonian.
One of the additions that's been made to the wall since then is a statue of nurses, right?
Indeed, yes.
And there actually is now a statue of 3 soldiers that was not part of the original design.
Yes.
Why were those added?
Well, the statue of the soldiers was added in 1984. The statue of the soldiers was an actual agreement we made. You might say it was a compromise agreement, because some people simply thought that we needed some realistic piece of art. So we agreed to push to have it added, and we convinced the Fine Arts Commission to do that. Of course, it takes, you can't create a beautiful statue overnight. So the Secretary, once the Fine Arts Commission approved having the statue in October of 1982, the Secretary of the Interior agreed to allow us to dedicate the memorial in November of '82, and then the statue was actually unveiled in November of '84, 2 years later.
And the tribute to the nurses?
I think the tribute to the nurses was added right around the late '80s. Maybe it was dedicated like in '90 or '91.
Yeah.
That was sort of a separate effort. It required its own legislation to get the site where it sits.
Well, the whole site is, as I said, a remarkable place to visit, and anyone who goes to Washington, D.C. can't have a real trip there without going to see the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Robert Dubeck is one of the people who helped create it 35 plus years ago and has written about that in a new book simply called Creating the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Robert, a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. May I give you an 800 number?
Absolutely.
Yes, it's 800-253-2187.
800-253-2187. That's great. I'm Paul Harris. This is the Big 550
Thank you.
KTRS.